My name is Eleanor, 68 years young, and I was Frank Mitchell's wife for 40 years until cancer took him 5 years ago. Last month, I attended what was supposed to be a regular family dinner at my son Thomas's house. I never imagined those monthly gatherings would become such a battlefield after Frank passed. That night, when Thomas, his wife Patricia, and Frank's brother Richard decided I was just the widow who should shut up, I simply smiled, walked out, and let fate unfold. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground against family who underestimated you. I spent my career as an English teacher at Lincoln High School in suburban Boston, teaching teenagers about the power of words and the importance of respect. The irony that my own family would forget these basic principles wasn't lost on me. Frank and I built our life here, raising our son Thomas in a modest but comfortable home filled with books and laughter. Frank started Mitchell Construction from nothing but a pickup truck and a toolbox, growing it into one of the most respected commercial building companies in Massachusetts. For 40 years, Frank was my partner in everything. Behind closed doors, he always consulted me on major business decisions. I had a knack for spotting potential problems and reading people that complemented his technical expertise. "Ellie," he'd say, "you see what I miss every time." But to the outside world, including our family, I was just Frank's supportive wife. I was fine with that arrangement. I never needed the spotlight. After Frank built the company into a regional powerhouse, Thomas joined straight out of his MBA program. Frank was thrilled to have his son follow in his footsteps, though he privately worried about Thomas's impatience and tendency to look for shortcuts. "Thomas wants to run before he can walk," Frank confided to me one night. "He sees the success, but not the 20 years of careful decisions that built it." When Frank passed away after a brutal 8-month battle with pancreatic cancer, the company's leadership fell to Thomas. At 42, our son had become increasingly entitled over the years. His wife, Patricia, a former marketing executive who quit to become a full-time socialite, encouraged this attitude. They lived in a mansion in Brookline that cost more than Frank and I had spent on our home, cars, and Thomas's education combined. "Mom, we need to make some changes around here," Thomas declared just 2 months after the funeral, sitting in what had been Frank's office. Dad's methods were becoming outdated. Patricia was worse. She'd married Thomas 15 years ago, and I'd tried to welcome her into our family. But she'd always viewed me as competition rather than family. After Frank died, she barely disguised her impatience with me. "Eleanor, don't you think it's time you downsized?" she suggested during one of the first family dinners after Frank's passing. "That house must feel so empty now, and the maintenance would overwhelm anyone your age." The fact that I'd managed our household affairs perfectly well for decades seemed irrelevant to her. The truth was, Patricia wanted my home for its valuable land. They'd already discussed tearing it down to build something more suitable for occasional family gatherings. Frank's brother Richard and his wife Diane were cut from similar cloth. Richard had always been jealous of Frank's success. He'd worked for the company in its early days, but left after disagreements about its direction. Frank had generously given him shares in the business anyway, making him wealthy without the work. Still, Richard believed he deserved more. "Frank always was the lucky one," he'd say, as if 40 years of 14-hour workdays was luck. Diane, much like Patricia, saw me as an obstacle. "Frank was too generous with Eleanor in the will," I overheard her telling Richard once. "She doesn't need all that money at her age." Thomas and Patricia's children, my grandchildren Ashley and Jason, were 17 and 15 when Frank died. They'd been raised with every advantage and none of the responsibility that had shaped their father. Ashley showed occasional flashes of sensitivity, but Jason mirrored his parents' entitled attitude. The monthly family dinners had been Frank's tradition. "Family stays together by breaking bread together," he always said. After his death, Thomas and Patricia continued hosting them, though the warmth that had characterized them under Frank disappeared. Instead, they became showcases for Thomas and Patricia's lifestyle and opportunities for them to make business connections. The only person who truly understood my situation was my best friend Grace Porter. We taught together at Lincoln High for 30 years, and she knew the real me beyond Frank's wife. Eleanor Mitchell, you've got more steel in your spine than all of them put together. Grace told me after I described a particularly condescending interaction with Thomas about company finances. Frank knew that. That's why he trusted you. Grace was right. Frank had trusted me more than anyone realized. And that trust would soon become very relevant. They treat you like you're invisible, Grace said during one of our weekly coffee dates. As if being a widow somehow diminished your brain. It's actually quite useful sometimes, I replied with a small smile. People reveal a lot when they think you don't matter. And over the 5 years since Frank's death, I'd observed plenty. Thomas making increasingly risky business moves. Richard encouraging him, hoping for bigger dividend payouts. Patricia spending money as if the company's success was guaranteed forever. All while treating me as an afterthought, someone to be managed and eventually sidelined completely. What none of them realized was that Frank and I had spent many quiet hours during his illness discussing exactly this possibility. Frank knew his son and brother better than they knew themselves. And he had prepared accordingly, with me as his silent partner. Ellie, he'd whispered one night in the hospital, I've arranged things to protect what we built. But it'll be up to you to decide when or if to use that protection. At the time, I'd hoped it would never be necessary. I wanted to believe Thomas would grow into the responsibility, that he would seek and value my input. For 5 years, I'd waited and watched, hoping for the best, but preparing for what increasingly seemed inevitable. The monthly family dinners became a barometer for how far things had deteriorated. Each month, I was treated with less consideration. Each month, Thomas made business announcements that would have horrified Frank. Each month, I offered gentle suggestions that were increasingly dismissed. Mom, Thomas said with thinly veiled irritation after I questioned a highly leveraged land purchase, business has changed since Dad's day. You need to trust that we know what we're doing. What Thomas didn't know was that I understood exactly what they were doing. And it was going to destroy everything Frank had built. The changes at Mitchell Construction began subtly after Frank's passing. Thomas redecorated the headquarters with sleek, modern furniture that cost a small fortune. He hired consultants to create a new company logo and branding that barely resembled the respected image Frank had cultivated. Small things, perhaps, but indicative of Thomas's priorities. More concerning were the strategic shifts. Frank had built the company on commercial office buildings and public works projects, steady income with manageable risks. Thomas began pursuing luxury condominium developments and speculative land deals, borrowing heavily against the company's previously solid assets. The margins are incredible on these high-end units, Thomas explained during a rare moment when he actually shared information with me. We'll triple our profits within 2 years. What he failed to mention was that these projects required perfect market conditions to succeed. Frank had always avoided such ventures, having weathered enough economic cycles to know that downturns were inevitable. During a family dinner about 3 years after Frank's death, I tried to raise this concern. Thomas, I remember the 2008 crisis hitting luxury developments particularly hard, I mentioned carefully. Frank always said having a diverse project portfolio was essential for stability. Richard laughed before Thomas could respond. Eleanor, the economy is completely different now. Frank was too conservative. He could have made twice what he did if he'd been more aggressive. Thomas nodded in agreement. Dad built a good foundation, but we need to evolve. The construction business has changed. Patricia chimed in, besides Eleanor. Wouldn't you rather see the company thrive instead of just maintaining? The way she said it made maintaining sound like failure. I let it go that night. But my concerns grew as I kept tabs on company developments through industry connections Frank had introduced me to years before. Thomas was leveraging the company to its limits, making promises to investors that would be difficult to fulfill if even one project faltered. 6 months later, I discovered Thomas had begun selling off stable income-producing properties to fund his riskier ventures. Properties that had been the company's financial backbone during previous economic downturns. When I called him to express my concern, he was dismissive. "Mom, those old buildings were underperforming. We're reinvesting in properties with actual growth potential." "Thomas, those properties provided consistent income regardless of market conditions. They were insurance." "We don't need that kind of insurance anymore," he replied impatiently. "The market's strong and getting stronger." Around this time, I inadvertently overheard a conversation between Thomas and Richard during a family gathering at Richard's home. I'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom when their voices drifted up from Richard's home office below. "She still owns 20% of the company," Richard was saying. "Plus whatever Frank left her personally. It's ridiculous." "Dad always was soft when it came to Mom," Thomas replied. "But we're looking into options. Michael's replacement thinks there might be ways to consolidate control." Michael had been Frank's attorney and friend for 30 years. Thomas had replaced him with a younger lawyer from a prestigious Boston firm shortly after taking control. "Good," Richard said. "We need to streamline decision-making. No offense to your mother, but she's from a different era. She doesn't understand modern business." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. They were actively working to push me out completely. The following week, I noticed I'd stopped receiving the quarterly financial reports that had always been sent to all shareholders. When I called the company's accounting department to ask about it, I was told the reporting procedure had changed and I should direct my questions to Thomas. My calls to Thomas went unreturned for 3 days. When he finally called back, he sounded harried. "Mom, we're streamlining a lot of the administrative processes. The detailed reports were confusing a lot of the smaller shareholders. We're sending simplified versions now." "I never found them confusing, Thomas. I've been reading those reports for decades." A long pause followed. "Look, if it's that important to you, I'll have someone drop off the full report. But honestly, Mom, you don't need to worry about these details. We've got everything under control." The simplified report arrived a week later. It contained barely a quarter of the information the previous reports had included, with many concerning details about debt levels and project timelines conspicuously absent. That evening, I made a call I'd been postponing for years. Michael Brodsky, Frank's attorney, had retired to Cape Cod but had always told me to contact him if I ever needed anything. "Eleanor." His warm voice brought tears to my eyes. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" "Not great, Michael. I think it's time to discuss what Frank called the contingency plan." There was a pause on the line. "I was wondering when you might call about that. Can you come down to the Cape this weekend?" Some things shouldn't be discussed over the phone. 2 days later, I sat in Michael's sunroom overlooking the ocean as he explained in detail what Frank had arranged before his death. Frank knew Thomas might take the company in a risky direction. Michael explained. He hoped it wouldn't happen, but he wanted you protected if it did. Michael opened a file and spread several documents across the table. Officially, Thomas controls 30% of the company. Richard has 15%. Various other shareholders hold small percentages. "And I have 20%, I added. Michael smiled. "That's what everyone believes. But Frank actually transferred an additional 31% to you through a series of holding companies. On paper, those companies appear to be owned by different entities, but you're the sole beneficial owner." I stared at him in shock. "I control 51% of Mitchell Construction." "Yes." Frank arranged it so you could remain in the background as long as you wished. He didn't want to create family conflict, but he also didn't want to leave you vulnerable. Why didn't he tell me this before he died? He did, in a way. Remember the letter he asked you not to open unless necessary? The letter had been part of a package of personal items Frank had given me during his final days. Only open this if Thomas takes the company somewhere dangerous, he'd said. I'd kept it in my safe, hoping I'd never need to read it. I should have opened it sooner, I whispered. Frank wanted to give Thomas a chance to prove himself, Michael said gently. He hoped Thomas would grow into the role. That night, I returned home and opened Frank's letter. His familiar handwriting brought fresh grief, but also determination. My dearest Ellie. It began. If you're reading this, then my fears about Thomas have come to pass. I've watched him become increasingly reckless and entitled, despite my attempts to teach him the values that matter. I hoped I was wrong, that responsibility would mature him. But if you've opened this letter, then you've seen enough to know the company is in jeopardy. You've always been my true partner, though few people know it. Your judgment about people and situations has saved us from disaster more times than I can count. Now I'm asking you to save what we built together one more time. Michael has all the documents you'll need. The company is truly yours to protect. Use this power wisely, as I know you will. Thomas may never forgive you. But someday he might understand that this was done out of love, not just for our company, but for him too. All my love, always Frank. I sat in my quiet living room until dawn, weighing the implications of what I'd learned and what I needed to do. The path ahead would be painful, but Frank had trusted me with his legacy. I wouldn't let him down. The evening of the fateful dinner arrived with dark clouds gathering over Boston, a fitting backdrop for what was to come. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress Frank had always loved, pearl earrings he'd given me for our 35th anniversary, and applied my makeup with extra care. If this was to be my last family dinner in my current role, I wanted to face it with dignity. I packed a leather portfolio containing key documents Michael had prepared. Not everything, just enough to make my point if necessary. I hoped it wouldn't come to that. But 5 years of watching Thomas dismantle Frank's careful work had exhausted my patience. Thomas and Patricia's home was lit up like a showcase when I arrived. Their massive Tudor revival sat on 2 acres in Brookline's most exclusive neighborhood, a monument to excess that always made me uncomfortable. A valet took my car, a service Thomas had recently added to their monthly dinners, though there was ample parking in their circular driveway. Mrs. Mitchell, good evening, the young man said politely. Thank you, David, I replied, having made a point to learn his name months ago. Frank had always said you can judge people by how they treat service staff. By that measure, Thomas and Patricia failed miserably. Patricia greeted me at the door with air kisses that never touched my cheeks. Eleanor, you're the last to arrive. Everyone's already having drinks in the solarium. The solarium had been the family room until Patricia decided the term was more elegant. It was filled with guests when I entered, more than our usual family gathering. Mom, there you are. Thomas approached with a tumbler of scotch in hand. I've been telling the Whitmores about your garden. They're looking to redo their landscaping. The Whitmores were potential investors in Thomas's newest development project, I realized. I was being used as a conversational prop to warm them up. Lovely to meet you, I said, shaking their hands. Though I should warn you, my garden is more practical than showpiece. Frank always said we should grow things we can eat. Mrs. Whitmore smiled genuinely. How refreshing. My grandmother had the same philosophy. I chatted with them briefly before excusing myself to greet Richard and Diane. Richard was holding court with several men I didn't recognize, gesturing expansively as he often did when exaggerating his role in the company's success. Eleanor, he nodded curtly when I approached. Richard, Diane, I replied evenly. I didn't realize this would be more than family tonight. Diane's smile was brittle. Thomas is networking for the Westlake project. These are potential partners. The way she emphasized partners made it clear she didn't consider me one. Throughout the cocktail hour, I observed Thomas working the room. He developed his father's charisma, but none of his caution. He made sweeping promises about returns on investment and guaranteed timelines that made me wince internally. Dinner was served in their formal dining room on china that cost more than most people's cars. Patricia had arranged the seating to place me at the far end of the table from Thomas, who sat at the head in what had been Frank's position. Richard was at Thomas's right hand, with the Whitmores and other potential investors clustered nearby. The first sign of trouble came during the salad course when Mr. Whitmore asked about the company's approach to risk management in the current volatile market. Before Thomas could answer, I spoke up from my end of the table. That's an excellent question. Frank always maintained substantial cash reserves and diversified our project types specifically to mitigate market fluctuations. A brief silence followed. Thomas cleared his throat. That was Dad's approach, yes. But we've evolved our strategy to capitalize on emerging opportunities. Cash reserves sitting idle are missed opportunities. Speaking of opportunities, Richard jumped in. Tell them about the Westlake acquisition, Thomas. Thomas launched into an enthusiastic description of a 200-acre property west of Boston that he planned to develop into luxury condominiums and high-end retail. As he outlined the leveraged financing structure and aggressive timeline, I felt a growing discomfort. We're projecting a 40% return within 18 months, Thomas concluded. The zoning is practically guaranteed given our relationships with the planning board. That's the site near the wetlands conservation area, isn't it? I asked innocently. Thomas's expression tightened slightly. It borders a protected area, yes. Frank was approached about that property years ago, I continued. He was concerned about environmental compliance issues and potential flooding risks. Has that situation changed? A palpable tension descended over the table. Thomas forced a laugh. Dad was overly cautious about environmental regulations. We've got excellent attorneys handling any potential issues. Environmental attorneys are expensive, I noted. And delays from permit challenges can destroy project timelines. Patricia interjected sharply, Eleanor, Thomas has thoroughly vetted this project. The environmental concerns are minimal. I took a sip of water. I'm sure he believes that. But Frank always said that environmental groups don't need to win their lawsuits to hurt you. They just need to delay you long enough to miss your financing windows. Richard scoffed. Frank was from a different era. The company needs to take calculated risks to grow. There's a difference between calculated risks and gambling, I replied quietly. Thomas's face flushed with anger. Mom, with all due respect, you're not involved in day-to-day operations. These discussions have been ongoing for months with our executive team. A team you've largely replaced in the last 3 years, I pointed out. Almost everyone who worked alongside Frank is gone. Because we needed fresh perspectives. Thomas's voice rose slightly. Dad's old guard was stuck in outdated thinking. Mr. Whitmore was watching this exchange with increasing interest. Mrs. Mitchell, you seem to have strong opinions on the company's direction. Are you formally involved in operations? Before I could answer, Patricia laughed dismissively. Eleanor was Frank's wife. She's not involved in the business side. Frank valued her input, Diane added with false sweetness. But the company has moved beyond sentimental management. I maintained my composure. I'm still a significant shareholder, Mr. Whitmore. And while I don't have an operational role, I've been connected to Mitchell Construction for over 40 years. Thomas waved his hand impatiently. Mom keeps up with company news, but she doesn't have a business background. Dad was protective of her. Frank respected my opinion, I corrected gently. He considered me his partner in all things. Partner is a generous term, Richard muttered. Just loud enough to be heard. I turned my gaze directly to him. Frank thought so. That's why he consulted me on every major decision, including whether to keep you on the board after the Robinson project failure. Richard's face darkened. The Robinson project had been his initiative years ago, a disaster Frank had quietly cleaned up while protecting his brother's reputation. That's ancient history, he snapped. And frankly, Eleanor, Your memory of events has always been selective. The dinner continued with mounting tension. When the main course arrived, Thomas steered the conversation back to the Westlake development, outlining what he called conservative projections that I knew were wildly optimistic. "We've secured preliminary financing at very favorable terms," he announced. "With the equity partners at this table, we can break ground by next quarter." "What about the wetlands survey?" I asked. "Has that been completed?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "We have preliminary assessments, but not the comprehensive environmental impact study that would hold up in court," I pressed. "Frank would never proceed without that. For God's sake." Patricia interrupted, setting down her fork with a clatter. "Frank this, Frank that. We're trying to have a business discussion about the future, not reminisce about how things used to be." "The company's past informs its future," I replied calmly. "Learning from experience isn't reminiscing, Mom." Thomas's voice had a warning edge. "We appreciate your concern, but these decisions have been thoroughly vetted by professionals, the same professionals who advised on the Riverfront project, because those projections were off by nearly 30%. That was an anomaly," Thomas insisted. "And we still made a profit. A fraction of what was projected, with twice the construction costs," I corrected. "Frank would never have considered that acceptable." Patricia threw her napkin on the table. "Please, Eleanor, enough about what Frank would have done. Frank is gone. Thomas runs the company now." The table fell silent. Even Thomas looked uncomfortable with his wife's bluntness. "I'm well aware that Frank is gone," I said quietly. "I was with him when he died." "Then perhaps," Patricia continued, her voice rising, "you should focus on being a grandmother and a widow and leave the business discussions to those who understand them." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think I am? Just a grandmother and a widow?" "What we think," Richard interjected, "is that you're interfering in matters beyond your expertise. Frank may have humored your input, but he made the real decisions himself." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Dad respected you, Mom, but business was his domain. He protected you from the harsh realities." "Protected me?" I repeated incredulously. "Yes," Patricia snapped, her patience clearly exhausted. "And now you're embarrassing yourself and Thomas by pretending to understand complex business matters. Please, just shut up. You're just the widow now. You had your time as Mrs. Mitchell, but that role is over." Gasps came from several guests. Even Thomas looked shocked at his wife's outburst. "Patricia," he hissed, "that's enough." But Richard was nodding in agreement. It needed to be said. "Eleanor, we all respect your position as Frank's widow, but your constant second-guessing of Thomas's leadership has to stop." I looked around the table, taking in the mix of embarrassment, discomfort, and in some cases, agreement on the faces before me. For 5 years, I'd watched, waited, and hoped. I'd given Thomas every chance to prove himself worthy of Frank's legacy. Instead, he'd squandered it, surrounded himself with yes-men, and now allowed his wife and uncle to speak to me as if I were nothing. Slowly, deliberately, I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I rose from my chair with the dignity Frank had always admired in me. "Well," I said with perfect composure, "if I'm just the widow with no valuable input to offer, there's no point in my staying for dessert." "Mom," Thomas began, suddenly realizing things had gone too far. Patricia didn't mean. "Oh, I think she did," I replied, picking up my purse and the leather portfolio I'd kept beside me. "And so did you in your way. You've made it abundantly clear that you believe Frank merely humored me, that my 40 years of partnership with him was an illusion." "That's not what we're saying," Richard backpedaled, aware of the uncomfortable atmosphere his words had created. "It's exactly what you're saying," I corrected him. "And perhaps you're right. Perhaps I am just a widow who should shut up and fade into the background." I walked toward the dining room door, then paused and turned back. The small, mysterious smile that crossed my face seemed to unnerve Thomas more than anger would have. One last thought before this widow leaves you to your important business discussion. Frank always said that the most dangerous moment in negotiation is when you believe you hold all the cards. That's when you miss what's hiding in plain sight. With that enigmatic statement hanging in the air, I walked out of my son's house with my head held high, ignoring his calls for me to come back. In the car, driving home through the rain that had begun to fall, I finally allowed myself to feel the pain of their cruelty, the tears mixing with determination. Frank had been right. The time for waiting was over. My house was quiet when I returned home, a 1920s colonial that Frank and I had lovingly restored over decades. It wasn't as grand as Thomas and Patricia's showcase, but it was filled with memories and meaning. Frank's presence still lingered in the study where he'd spent evenings reviewing contracts, in the kitchen where we'd shared morning coffee, in the garden we'd tended together. I hung my coat in the hallway closet and headed straight to Frank's study. The room remained largely as he'd left it, though I'd moved some things to make it more my own over the years. I went to the painting behind his desk, a New England seascape by a local artist we'd discovered on our 20th anniversary trip. Swinging it aside revealed a wall safe Frank had installed when the company first became successful. The combination was our wedding date followed by the latitude and longitude of where we'd met at Boston University. Inside were our most important documents, wills, insurance policies, property deeds, and at the back, a sealed envelope Frank had given me during his final week. This contains everything Michael has prepared, he'd told me. Only use it if you have to, Ellie. Give Thomas a chance to grow into the role first. I'd given Thomas 5 years of chances. I'd watched him systematically dismantle the company's safety nets, alienate its most loyal employees, and leverage its stable assets for increasingly risky ventures. Tonight had simply been the final confirmation that Thomas, Patricia, and Richard would never see me as anything but an obstacle to their ambitions. I took the envelope to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside were documents detailing the complex ownership structure Frank had created, transferring controlling interest in Mitchell Construction to me through a series of holding companies. There were also detailed reports on the company's historic performance, projections based on Frank's conservative management approach, and notes about key employees Frank had trusted. Most revealing was a letter from Frank to Thomas that had never been delivered. "Son," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've taken the company in a direction that threatened its future. And your mother has been forced to intervene. I know this will feel like betrayal to you, but understand that this was my decision, not hers. I've watched you chase shortcuts your entire life. You have so many gifts, Thomas: intelligence, charisma, vision. But you lack patience and humility. Success isn't built overnight, and it isn't maintained through recklessness. Your mother has always been my true partner. Few people know that many of my best business decisions came from her insights. I relied on her judgment about people and situations more than anyone else's. She saw things I missed. She advised caution when I was too eager and encouraged risk when I was too conservative. I hope someday you'll understand this wasn't about trust, but about protection. Not just of the company, but of you from yourself. Sometimes the greatest act of love is preventing someone from making a catastrophic mistake. With love and hope, Dad." I folded the letter carefully, tears blurring my vision. How well Frank had known our son. How accurately he'd predicted this moment. I reached for my phone and called Michael. "It happened," I said when he answered. "They finally showed their true colors." "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he replied sincerely. "What did they do?" I recounted the dinner's events, ending with Patricia's demand that I shut up because I was just the widow. Michael's sigh was heavy with disappointment. Frank worried about Thomas's character. And he never trusted Richard. "Are you ready to proceed?" "Yes," I said firmly. "It's time to implement the contingency plan." For the next hour, Michael walked me through the steps we would take. First, he would file the appropriate paperwork officially revealing my majority ownership. Then, We would call an emergency board meeting where I would remove Thomas as CEO and Richard from the board entirely. What about the Westlake project? I asked. Thomas has apparently secured preliminary financing and is bringing in equity partners. Based on what you've told me about the environmental issues, that project is a disaster waiting to happen, Michael replied. We'll need to review all the contracts immediately. But my guess is we can still withdraw without catastrophic damage if we act quickly. After finishing with Michael, I made one more call to Grace. You finally did it, she said when I explained what had happened. Thank God. I've been watching you suffer their disrespect for years. I kept hoping Thomas would grow up, I admitted. That he'd become the man Frank believed he could be. Some people only learn through consequences, Grace replied. This may be the best thing that could happen to Thomas in the long run. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the documents Frank and Michael had prepared. There were detailed analyses of the company's operations, projections, and potential vulnerabilities. Frank had thought of everything, even preparing a list of trusted executives who had left the company but might return under new leadership. At dawn, I made coffee and watched the sunrise from our kitchen window. Frank and I had shared this view for 40 years, planning our days and discussing our dreams. I felt his presence strongly in that moment, supporting my resolve. I won't let them destroy what we built, I whispered to his memory. I promise. As morning light filled the kitchen, my phone rang. It was Michael. The paperwork is ready, he said. I've scheduled the board meeting for 9 a.m. Are you prepared for this, Eleanor? It won't be pretty. I've been preparing for 5 years, I replied. Let's do this. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit Frank had always said made me look formidable. As I fastened his mother's pearl necklace around my throat, I thought about Patricia's sneering dismissal, "You're just the widow now." She had no idea what this widow was capable of. I arrived at Mitchell Construction headquarters at 8:30 a.m., half an hour before the emergency board meeting Michael had called. The familiar 12-story building in downtown Boston had been the company's home for 20 years. Frank had personally overseen its construction, insisting on quality materials and thoughtful design that would stand the test of time. The security guard at the desk, Walter, had been with the company since before the building existed. His eyebrows rose in surprise when I approached. Mrs. Mitchell. Good morning. We don't see you here often these days. Good morning, Walter. That's about to change, I replied with a smile. Is the conference room on 12 ready for the board meeting? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Brodsky arrived 15 minutes ago and asked that everything be prepared. Walter's expression showed curiosity, but his professionalism prevented him from asking questions. Thank you. I expect the other board members will be arriving shortly. Please send them up as they arrive. The executive elevator whisked me to the top floor where Frank's office had been. Thomas had redecorated it in sleek, modern furniture that bore no trace of his father's practical elegance. Outside, Frank's longtime assistant Margaret looked up in surprise. Eleanor, I didn't know you were coming in today. Last-minute development, I explained. Is the conference room ready? Yes, Michael Brodsky has been setting up. But she lowered her voice. Thomas doesn't know about this meeting. He's going to be furious. I'm counting on you to help keep things professional, Margaret, I said. This is going to be a challenging day. Margaret had been with Frank from the early days. Thomas had tried to replace her 3 times, but she knew too much about the company's operations to be easily dismissed. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Does this have something to do with the Westlake project? Because Thomas has been making promises I don't think the company can keep. It has to do with everything, I replied. And I'll need loyal people like you in the coming weeks. In the conference room, Michael was arranging documents at each seat around the massive table. He looked up when I entered. Everything's ready, he said. I've prepared statements for each scenario we discussed. The legal team is on standby. Thank you, Michael. For everything. Frank was my friend for 30 years, he replied. I'm fulfilling a promise to him. But more than that, I'm doing what's right for this company. The board members began arriving shortly after. Mitchell Construction had a 9-person board: Thomas, Richard, myself, and 6 others. A mix of company executives Thomas had appointed and outside directors. Their faces registered surprise at seeing me seated at the head of the table where Frank used to sit, with Michael beside me. Thomas and Richard arrived last, entering mid-conversation about the Westlake project. Thomas stopped abruptly when he saw me. "Mom? What are you doing here?" "And Michael?" His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You're retired." "I was," Michael replied evenly. "Special circumstances bring me back temporarily." "What special circumstances?" Richard demanded, remaining standing. "And why wasn't I informed about this meeting?" "Please take your seats," I said calmly. "All will be explained." Reluctantly, they sat down. Thomas at the opposite end of the table from me. "I've called this emergency meeting," I began, "to address serious concerns about the company's current direction and to implement necessary changes to its leadership structure." "You called this meeting?" Thomas interrupted incredulously. "On what authority?" Michael slid a document to the center of the table. "On the authority of the majority shareholder of Mitchell Construction." A confused murmur ran through the room. Thomas laughed dismissively. "I'm the largest shareholder with 30%. Mom has 20. Richard has 15. Nobody has a majority. That's what the shareholder records have indicated." I acknowledged, "But they're incomplete." Michael distributed copies of legal documents to everyone present. 5 years ago, before his death, Frank Mitchell restructured the company's ownership through a series of holding companies. These entities, which appear unrelated on paper, are in fact all controlled by Eleanor Mitchell. Combined with her direct ownership, Mrs. Mitchell controls 51% of Mitchell Construction. A stunned silence fell over the room. Thomas snatched up the documents, scanning them frantically. "This is impossible," he sputtered. "Dad would never have done this behind my back." "He did it to protect the company," I replied evenly. "And to protect you from yourself, Thomas. He hoped it would never be necessary to reveal this arrangement." Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is a fraud." "It has to be. Frank would have told me." "Frank knew your ambitions too well to trust you with this information, Richard," I said. "He remembered how you pressured him to take on excess debt in the early days, nearly bankrupting the company. He forgave that, but he didn't forget." "So what now?" asked Diane Henderson, one of the outside directors. "What does this mean for the company?" "It means," I continued, "that as majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to make immediate changes to leadership." "Effective immediately." "Thomas Mitchell is removed as Chief Executive Officer of Mitchell Construction." Thomas jumped to his feet. "You can't do this. I've run this company for 5 years. And in that time," I countered, "you've depleted its cash reserves, leveraged its stable assets for speculative ventures, driven away key longtime employees, and committed to projects with potentially catastrophic legal and financial risks." I nodded to Michael, who distributed another set of documents. "These reports detail the company's financial position under Frank's leadership compared to now. Note the debt-to-equity ratios, cash reserves, and project risk assessments." The board members began reviewing the figures, their expressions growing increasingly concerned. "Additionally," I continued, "Richard Mitchell is removed from the board of directors." "Effective immediately." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "This is outrageous. You have no grounds. The grounds are your consistent encouragement of reckless business practices and your attempt, documented in these emails, to manipulate company governance to your personal benefit." Michael placed copies of email exchanges between Thomas and Richard in front of each board member. As the remaining board members reviewed the documents, their expressions shifted from shock to concern. "Mrs. Mitchell," said James Peterson, an outside director who had served since Frank's time, "these figures are alarming." I had no idea our financial position had deteriorated so significantly. That information was deliberately obscured in the reports presented to the board, Michael explained. Thomas authorized simplified financial summaries that omitted critical details. Thomas remained standing, his face flushed with anger. You've been planning this ambush for years, haven't you? Sitting back, pretending to be just the helpless widow while secretly plotting to take over. I gave you 5 years to prove yourself, Thomas, I replied calmly. 5 years of watching you dismantle your father's legacy piece by piece. I tried to advise you. You chose to tell me to shut up because I'm just the widow. Several board members looked uncomfortable at this revelation. What about current projects? Asked Diane Henderson. Particularly Westlake. We have commitments. We'll conduct a complete review of all ongoing projects, I replied. Those that are viable will continue. Those that present unacceptable risks will be restructured or terminated. You can't just terminate Westlake, Thomas shouted. We have partners, financing arrangements, contractors. The preliminary environmental assessment you commissioned was grossly inadequate, I said. Frank looked at that property years ago and identified at least 3 serious issues that would make development nearly impossible. You ignored those concerns. We have workarounds. Thomas insisted. Illegal ones, perhaps, Michael interjected. The current plans would violate at least 4 environmental regulations. The fines alone could bankrupt the company. The meeting continued for another hour as we outlined the immediate changes. An interim CEO would be appointed from among the company's former executives while a search was conducted. A complete financial and legal audit would begin immediately. All major projects would be reviewed for viability. Throughout, Thomas became increasingly desperate, alternating between threats of legal action and attempts to convince the other board members to side with him. But the evidence was too compelling. By the end, even those he had appointed were voting to approve the changes. As the meeting concluded, Thomas made one final appeal. Mom, you can't do this to me. To your own son. Dad would never have wanted this. I met his gaze steadily. Your father wanted you to be worthy of his legacy, Thomas. He would be heartbroken to see what you've done with it. This isn't punishment. It's intervention. As the board members filed out, Michael and I remained. Thomas stood at the opposite end of the table, his hands braced on its surface. This isn't over, he said coldly. I'll fight this. You're welcome to try, Michael replied. But I assure you, Frank's arrangements are legally unassailable. Thomas stormed out, nearly colliding with Margaret in the doorway. Mrs. Mitchell, she said urgently, Patricia is on line 1. She sounds upset. I picked up the conference room phone and pressed the blinking button. Eleanor. Patricia's voice was shrill with panic. What the hell is happening? My credit cards were just declined at Neiman Marcus. All of them. And the bank says our accounts are frozen. As part of the leadership transition, I explained calmly. All company-related personal accounts have been temporarily suspended pending audit. Thomas has been using company funds for personal expenses, Patricia. That ends today. How are we supposed to live? She demanded. What about our mortgage payment? You and Thomas have personal funds, I'm sure. The company will no longer be your personal ATM. After hanging up, I turned to Michael. That went about as expected. You handled it well, he said. Frank would be proud. I didn't want it to come to this, I admitted. I genuinely hoped Thomas would grow into the role. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way, Michael replied. This may be the best thing that could happen to Thomas in the long run. As I left the building, I passed Walter at the security desk. Have a good day, Mrs. Mitchell, he called. I smiled. I already have, Walter. And please, call me Eleanor. I'll be seeing a lot more of you from now on. 1 week after the board meeting, I sat in my living room preparing for what would surely be a difficult encounter. Thomas, Patricia, Richard, and Diane had requested to meet with me at my home. Through Michael, I had agreed, stipulating that no attorneys would be present. This needed to be a family conversation first and foremost. The past week had been a whirlwind. I had appointed Franklin Turner, Frank's former COO whom Thomas had pushed out 3 years earlier, as interim CEO. Frank had stepped in with a steady hand, immediately beginning a thorough review of the company's position. "It's worse than we thought, Eleanor," he'd told me yesterday. "The Westlake project alone could have sunk us. The environmental issues are substantial, and Thomas had personally guaranteed several loans that the company couldn't possibly repay if the project failed." I'd also met with key employees, many of whom expressed relief at the change in leadership. Thomas had created a culture of fear and favoritism that had demoralized the once cohesive team Frank had built. The doorbell rang precisely at 2 o'clock. I took a deep breath and went to answer it. They stood on my porch like strangers, though I'd known Richard for over 40 years and had welcomed Patricia into our family 15 years ago. Thomas's face was rigid with suppressed anger. Patricia's eyes were puffy from crying. Richard looked belligerent, while Diane seemed uncharacteristically subdued. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. They filed into my living room silently. No one took the refreshments I'd set out. "Well," Thomas began without preamble, "you've certainly been busy destroying what Dad built." "That's an interesting perspective," I replied calmly, "considering what I've spent the past week trying to salvage." "You humiliated me," he continued, his voice rising. "I was escorted out of my own company by security. My accounts are frozen. My reputation is in tatters. The accounts linked to company funds are frozen pending audit," I corrected. "Your personal accounts remain untouched." "Our personal accounts can't cover our mortgage," Patricia interjected. "We have commitments, a standard of living." "A standard of living funded by the company," I noted. "Frank never believed in using company resources for personal luxury. That was your innovation, Thomas." Richard leaned forward aggressively. "Cut the sanctimonious act, Eleanor. This was a calculated power grab. You waited until Thomas had taken all the risks, done all the hard work of expanding the company, and then swooped in to take control." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think happened?" "Thomas took risks, certainly. Unnecessary, potentially catastrophic risks with other people's money and livelihoods. As for expanding the company, its value has decreased by 22% under his leadership, despite a booming construction market." "That's a temporary situation," Thomas insisted. "The Westlake project would have changed everything." "The Westlake project would have bankrupted us," I countered. "The environmental review you commissioned deliberately overlooked critical issues that would have prevented development. The full assessment we've now completed confirms what Frank suspected years ago, that property is undevelopable without massive remediation costs." "We had workarounds," Thomas muttered. "Illegal ones," I said firmly. "The company Frank built does not operate that way." "So what now?" Patricia demanded. "You've taken everything from us. Are you happy?" "I haven't taken anything that was rightfully yours," I replied. "The company was never Thomas's to run as he pleased. It was a stewardship he failed to honor." "We're prepared to take legal action," Richard stated. "Frank's secretive transfer of shares won't hold up in court." I smiled slightly. "Before you go down that road, there's something you should see." I reached for a remote control and turned on the television mounted on the wall. A video began playing, showing Frank sitting in his study, looking thin but determined, clearly recorded during his illness. "Hello, Thomas," Richard, Frank began. "If you're watching this, then Eleanor has been forced to reveal the ownership arrangement I created. I'm sure you're angry. You probably feel betrayed. But this was my decision, not hers." Thomas stared at his father's image, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "I built Mitchell Construction from nothing," Frank continued. "It represents not just my life's work, but a legacy of integrity and sound business principles. Eleanor has been my true partner from the beginning, though few people know it. Many of my best decisions came from her insights. Richard scoffed, but his eyes never left the screen. Thomas, I've watched you grow increasingly reckless and entitled, Frank continued. I hoped giving you leadership would foster responsibility. Eleanor has waited 5 years, giving you every chance to prove yourself. If she's taken action, it's because you left her no choice. Frank's gaze seemed to bore into Thomas from beyond the grave. Richard, your resentment has clouded your judgment for decades. Instead of mentoring Thomas, you've encouraged his worst impulses, hoping for greater dividends without concern for the company's health. Richard's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This arrangement is legally unassailable, Frank concluded. Michael and I made certain of that. You can fight it and waste resources, or you can accept it and perhaps learn from it. The choice is yours. Eleanor has my complete confidence and authority. I hope someday you'll understand this was done out of love, not malice. The video ended. Silence filled the room. Dad knew, Thomas whispered finally. He knew what you were going to do. He knew what you might force me to do, I corrected gently. He hoped it would never be necessary. So what now? Patricia asked, her voice smaller than before. We're just cut off? Cast out? That depends on you, I replied. I have a proposal. I outlined the options I'd prepared with Michael and Franklin. Thomas and Richard could return to the company in reduced capacities, working under close supervision. Thomas would need to start in operations, learning the business from the ground up as Frank had always intended. Richard could retain a non-voting advisory role. Both would receive fair compensation, though not the excessive packages they'd arranged for themselves. This is insulting, Thomas sputtered. You expect me to come back as a junior manager. I expect you to earn back trust. I replied, to demonstrate that you can put the company's interests above your own. I'd rather start my own company, he declared. With what capital? I asked. And what track record? The industry knows what happened, Thomas. Richard had been unusually quiet since the video ended. Now he cleared his throat. What exactly would my advisory role entail? You know the industry, I acknowledged. You have connections. That has value, used properly. He nodded slowly, surprising me. I'll consider it. Patricia had been staring at the floor. Now she looked up, tears in her eyes. We'll lose the house. Everything. You won't be destitute, I assured her. But yes, some downsizing will be necessary. The lifestyle you've become accustomed to was built on company resources that weren't properly authorized. Diane, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke. Eleanor, I owe you an apology. We all do. The things we said at that dinner. She looked genuinely remorseful. I got caught up in it all. The status, the lifestyle. I forgot who built all this in the first place. Her unexpected contrition seemed to break something in Thomas. He stood abruptly. I can't listen to this. You're all acting like I did something wrong. I was growing the company, taking risks. Yes, but that's business. There's a difference between calculated risks and recklessness, I said, echoing Frank's words. You never learned that distinction. Come on, Patricia. Thomas grabbed his coat. We're done here. Patricia hesitated, looking torn. Thomas, maybe we should consider. Consider what? Working under my mother's thumb? Being treated like an intern in the company that should be mine. The company was never yours, I said quietly. It was entrusted to you. There's a difference. Thomas stormed out. After an apologetic glance at me, Patricia followed. Richard and Diane remained seated. The fight seemed to have gone out of Richard. Frank really set all this up, he asked. He didn't trust his own son and brother. He hoped he was wrong about both of you, I replied. He gave you every chance to prove him wrong. Richard nodded slowly. I always thought he was too cautious, too conservative. And yet the company thrived under that caution, I pointed out, while nearly failing under Thomas's vision. I'll think about your offer, Richard said finally, standing to leave. It's more generous than I would have been in your position. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet house, emotionally drained but strangely at peace. I hadn't wanted this confrontation, but it had been necessary. Frank had entrusted me with protecting what we'd built together. I wouldn't let him down. As evening fell, the doorbell rang again. I opened it to find my granddaughter Ashley standing there, looking nervous. "Grandma," she said hesitantly, "can we talk?" I welcomed her in, surprised by her visit. At 22, Ashley had recently graduated from college and had been working part-time at the company during school breaks. "I know Dad and Mom are furious," she began once we were seated. "But I wanted to hear your side. The company employees are saying good things about what you did." "I did what was necessary," I explained. "Your grandfather built something special. It deserved to be protected." "Dad always made it sound like Grandpa was old-fashioned, too cautious," she said. "But the people who worked with him for years tell different stories." "Your grandfather understood that business isn't just about profits," I told her. "It's about people, relationships, integrity. Things that don't show up clearly on balance sheets, but determine long-term success." Ashley nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand. And I want to apologize for how we've all treated you since Grandpa died. Like you were just, I don't know, just the widow," I suggested gently. She looked ashamed. "Yes, that was wrong. And what Mom said at that dinner was horrible." "Thank you for saying that, Ashley. It means a lot." "What happens now?" she asked. "With the company? With our family?" "That depends partly on your father's choices," I replied. "But regardless, there will always be a place for you at Mitchell Construction if you want it. You have potential your grandfather would have recognized." Ashley smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from my family in a long time. "I'd like that, Grandma. I really would." As she left, I felt a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps Frank's legacy would continue after all, just not in the way any of us had expected. 6 months passed, bringing changes I could never have predicted. The autumn leaves were turning in my garden as I sat with Grace on the patio, enjoying what might be the last warm day of the season. "So Thomas and Patricia really moved to Arizona?" Grace asked, sipping her tea. "Yes, last month," I confirmed. Thomas refused all offers to return to the company. His pride couldn't accept the conditions. Patricia finally convinced him that a fresh start somewhere else was their best option. Thomas had remained bitter and unforgiving. Our contact had dwindled to formal emails about family matters, with him refusing my calls. Patricia, surprisingly, had reached out separately, apologizing again for her behavior. She admitted the lifestyle they'd built had been unsustainable and, based on company funds, they had no right to use. Their new life in Phoenix was more modest, but, she hinted, perhaps healthier for their marriage. "And Richard?" Grace inquired. "I still can't believe he came back to the company." Richard's transformation had been the most unexpected development. After initially rejecting my offer, he had returned 3 weeks later with a different attitude. I talked to some of the old-timers, he'd admitted. People who worked with Frank from the beginning. They helped me see things differently. Frank was right about a lot of things I criticized him for. Richard had accepted a non-voting advisory position, focusing on client relationships where his natural charm was an asset. Under supervision, his contributions had proven valuable. Diane had become an ally, organizing company social events and community outreach programs that strengthened the Mitchell construction culture. Franklin Turner has worked wonders as CEO, I told Grace. The company's finances have stabilized, and we've returned to the type of projects Frank preferred: steady, reliable work with reasonable margins and minimal risk. The transition hadn't been without challenges. We'd had to withdraw from the Westlake project, negotiating settlements with partners and investors. The environmental issues had proven even worse than initially feared, validating Frank's original assessment. Had we proceeded, the resulting legal and financial disaster would have bankrupted the company. And Ashley? How's she doing in her new role? Grace asked. My granddaughter had surprised everyone by demonstrating a natural aptitude for the business. After completing a formal management training program, she had joined the project development team, showing the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Frank's approach. She reminds me of Frank sometimes, I said with a smile. She asks the right questions, considers all angles before making decisions. She has his patience and his wisdom in recognizing talent, Grace added, gesturing toward me. Frank always saw what others missed in you. Now Ashley is learning from you directly, without the filter Thomas created. The company culture had healed remarkably quickly once toxic leadership was removed. Many longtime employees expressed relief at returning to the values that had made Mitchell Construction successful in the first place. New hires were selected not just for technical skills, but for their alignment with our core principles of integrity, quality, and respect. I had taken no formal role in day-to-day operations, but served as board chair, providing guidance on major decisions. My influence was most felt in the company's renewed commitment to employee development and community involvement, areas Frank had always prioritized but Thomas had dismissed as unnecessary expenses. I never wanted any of this, I confessed to Grace. Being thrust into the spotlight, making these difficult decisions. I was content being Frank's partner behind the scenes. But when it mattered, you stepped forward, Grace replied. That's what real strength is, Eleanor. Not seeking power, but accepting responsibility when it's needed. My phone chimed with a message. It was from Michael, sharing good news about a major public works project we'd just been awarded. The client had specifically cited Mitchell Construction's reputation for integrity as a deciding factor. Frank would be proud, Grace said, reading the message over my shoulder. Not just of the company, but of you. I still miss him every day, I admitted. I keep thinking about what he taught me over our 40 years together. Patience. Perseverance. Standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult, Grace corrected gently. The greatest lesson from this ordeal wasn't about business strategy or family dynamics, though I'd learned plenty about both. It was about the quiet dignity of knowing your own worth, even when others fail to recognize it. About having the courage to act decisively when necessary, despite the personal cost. You know what Frank used to say about respect? I asked Grace. That it isn't demanded or even earned so much as recognized. People either have the wisdom to see your value or they don't. And if they don't, Grace asked, then you continue being valuable anyway and let time reveal the truth. That philosophy had guided me through 5 difficult years of being underestimated and dismissed. In the end, it wasn't vindication I sought, but protection of something precious, the company Frank had built, the values we had shared, the legacy we had created together. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my garden, I thought about all the women throughout history who had been dismissed as just wives, widows, mothers. How many had carried wisdom and strength that went unrecognized? How many had made crucial contributions from the shadows? Being underestimated can be a kind of power, I mused. People reveal themselves when they think you don't matter. A lesson Thomas and Richard learned too late, Grace noted. Perhaps not too late for Richard, I countered. And definitely not too late for Ashley. Each generation has a chance to do better than the last. That evening, after Grace left, I sat in Frank's study, looking at his photograph on the desk. We did it, my love, I whispered. We protected what matters. The company would continue, perhaps stronger than before for having weathered this storm. The values Frank and I had built it on would endure. And perhaps most importantly, a new generation would understand that wisdom comes in many forms. And dismissing someone as just a widow might be the most expensive mistake they ever make. I hope this story reminds you to value the quiet wisdom around you. To recognize that true worth isn't always found in the loudest voice or the most impressive title. If you've ever been underestimated, or if you've stood your ground when others tried to diminish you, Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening, and remember, your value doesn't diminish because someone fails to see it.